Hello, my name is Pat Waters. I am an Australian artist living in a most beautiful bush environment in the foothills of the Great Dividing Range in Victoria. I have just completed the most wonderful retrospective of my painting, drawing and printmaking, which spans several decades. My themes are very complex. I'm very concerned about the state of the world. I'm very concerned about how I deal with the problems and concerns of our times. So I work politically and I work metaphorically and symbolically, trying to communicate the strong feelings I have about many issues of concern to me. I have a long history of being a political activist, working with marginalised people, being committed to the environment, and then my task is to translate that into visual art and make concrete ideas and possible ways of alternative thinking. So I put a lot of effort into the painting, which sometimes I think is quite difficult for people, but hopefully accessible enough to inspire them to offer more to the world. What we're looking at is the tragedy of the boat sinking against the rocks on Christmas Island coastline in 2010, and this was the very beginning of my sense of I must do something as protest against the way that we're dealing with refugees who arrive on our shores looking for asylum. I couldn't believe that this image was happening almost as I was looking at it. The boat was being pummeled and overwhelmed by the waves. People were falling off the boat and in the water, drowning, unable to be rescued by anybody higher on the cliffs that we can see in the foreground there, unable to do anything to help apart from throwing in some life-saving buoys and so forth, which did very little. And there were dozens of people who drowned. This second image followed the boat floundering, people going into the water, and women and children drowning. My grandson was 8 months old at this time when I was watching all this happen, and I read in the newspaper the following day that a mother and her 8-month-old child died. Same child age as my grandson, and they both drowned. I was devastated. I don't think I'd ever felt quite as angry, ashamed, sad as I did on that occasion. This image is of a man in the water. You get a sense of the giant waves that he is combating. Because he comes from the Middle East, he probably has no idea of how to save himself in the water and would be submerged fairly quickly, I would think. And I did a number of images like this with people clinging to floating objects in the water, struggling very much to survive, and most of them dying. This image of a refugee with his lips sewn up belongs to those who actually made it to shore and were then put into detention in many of the detention places we set up in Curtin or Port Augusta, the very many venues that we had. And because it went on interminably with no sight in end, to how long they were to be detained, they began their protests. One of the protests was sewing their lips together so they they couldn't eat. What I was striving for in this particular picture was to make the eyes carry the message of confusion, non-understanding about why they were being treated like this when they were trying to find safe harbour, the loss of hope. I was wanting to make that all happen with the expression in the eyes. There were so many people with this expression in their eyes, loss of hope, and that's because of what our Australian government did. Harbinger. This is an image that comes from a dream I had. I work a lot with dreams. I believe that dreams are important. They are messages coming from deep within our psyche, and the important dreams wake you up, and there are a number of very, very interesting people who write down their dreams. And this particular picture of the whale coming from the deep and the bird coming from the sky is a particular dream that was very important. The bird is carrying a poisoned fish, and the whale, known as the great mother of the deep, if she swallows that fish, there will be tragedy. This is my psyche alerting me to some danger, and I am very cognizant of the fact that I need to take notice. The painting took a long time because I couldn't understand the dream for a long time. When I finally did understand it and had the insight the dream was carrying, gained the insight the dream was carrying, the whale avoided swallowing the fish, which would have led to its death. This is Bosnia, a painting that I did after reading a front page article in The Age about an incredible home invasion during that war, Bosnia-Herzegovina, where a murderous group killed the family and one of them raped and murdered a young girl aged 12. My daughter was 12 at the time, and I was horrified by this story, so the image has a very personal content for me. The face of the killer, the murderer, has become that of a monster because the question arises in me every time I read articles about war, about what happens to people, to soldiers, to fighters in a war situation. It somehow gives them permission to become the blackest, the evil doers that they would never be if they weren't in a war situation. It's a conundrum for me because I cannot believe the cruelty or inhumanity that occurs in war. This is one of 36 drawings and works on paper that I did for an exhibition called Europa Australis. It's a mythological tale, and mythological tales of ancient Greece or Egypt or Christianity carry wisdom, they carry great wisdoms. They are delivered by way of allegory or metaphor, and I am most interested in the visual outcomes of these allegories or metaphors. And the story of Europa is that she was seduced and carried away by Zeus, disguised as a bull. And Europa bore him 3 children, and it actually describes the masculine and feminine principle that exists within us all. Europa is actually the feminine element within the human psyche, and the bull refers to the masculine. The masculine is very assertive and aggressive, highly creative, but very, very dominant. And it is the role of the feminine to tame that masculine and to retain a balance. It follows logically upon the story of Bosnia, because it is the feminine element, I believe, that gets lost in war, and the male aggressive element which becomes totally dominating. Once again, this is Europa and Zeus, and what I've done with the image making here is add a more mythical quality to it. Because it is a myth, I've stylised and become incredibly aggressive with the drawing to talk about the battle going on between the masculine and the feminine. And what is happening is that the left arm of Europa is trying to pull down the left horn of the bull to tame the bull and to equalise those two principles that exist within us all. I need to say that this too started with a dream that woke me up, and the dream had to do with a bull raging and trying to break down the door of the house that I was in to get at me. So it was a very important dream once again that I had to take notice of. And out of that dream came this series of drawings. This image belonged to a competition where the subject matter was a vessel. We had to create a vessel, an image of a vessel somehow. And when I began the work, I wasn't thinking too much of anything other than a container, and I drew with broad gestural strokes a container, and when I looked at that shape I realised that what I'd drawn was actually a breast, and from the breast came the idea of nurturing, and from the idea of nurturing somehow or another came the idea of earth. And I called this picture Earth, She Holds Us All. And I think I was very caught up in the whole idea of conservation and looking after the earth. She nurtures us and we should also nurture her. This is called the Embrace of the Mother, and it uses a technique called monoprinting. It has to be kept very simple. I thought it was a bit Loonig-like when I'd finished it, but there's an ambiguity about it because you're not sure if it's the mother embracing the child or the child embracing the mother. Either way, it speaks of great mutual love and understanding, and to be sought after by all mothers and daughters, and in fact all parents and child. This is a monotype, a printmaking technique, which is called the Black Madonna. The Black Madonna is an archetype, and that is some symbolic idea that has travelled down through centuries and across cultures. And the Black Madonna is usually a figurative image which is recognisable. The Black Madonna is not negroid. She has Western features when it is figurative, and she holds a Western-looking child. However, the image really talks about the blackness of the Madonna, and it is in her blackness that the mystery resides. And that mystery relates to the mystery of being. She is regarded as, if you like, the mysterious Madonna, the chthonic Madonna having to do with the deepest, darkest needs of us all. This is Lilith, and a lot of people haven't heard of Lilith, but she was actually Adam's first wife in that ancient myth to do with the Garden of Eden and the eating of the apple. Lilith was created by God at the same time as he created Adam, out of the same dust and earth, so that they were created equally out of the same stuff. And Lilith wished to retain that equality and would not submit or be submissive to Adam. She would not lie beneath him. And she was ordered to do so by God, but resisted and left the garden. And she was sent for by God. Two of the archangels went to get her, and once again she refused to return. So she was then subsequently demonised and became the succubi that visited men at night. She was assumed that she ate children and committed the worst acts that could be committed. However, Lilith became a mythological heroine, and feminists today, or women seeking real equality, have revived Lilith, and she now exists once again in literature as she did many centuries ago. Eve was Adam's second wife and was not made of equal stuff, but as you know, came of Adam's rib, so therefore she was submissive. Now this is Porto Covo in Portugal, and it's the coastline of that particular place, and I was so moved by it that I demanded to go back there, even though it was hard for us to get there while we were travelling, and I did many sketches and 2 works on paper trying to reflect the absolute majesty and terrific drama of that particular coastline. So this is one of 2, and it was indeed magnificent. This comes from a major series of works, once again, that had to do with a myth, the myth of Salome and the 7 veils, which required of Salome that she danced for King Herod and remove the veils that covered her naked body. Symbolically, the veils represent delusions of ourselves, delusions that we hold, and delusions that interfere with us being whole people, being fully in charge of living an authentic life. And this one is called addiction. And painting-wise, I've created a strong contrast between the light and the dark, the light being the core self, the true self, and it's being restrained or held back by darkness, which is the addiction. And the addiction can be one that we understand fully today, heroin or any other terrible drug, alcohol, but could also mean ways of being, ways of thinking, ways of acting that do not reflect our true selves, but to which we are addicted because we can't change them. This one is of the same series, and it's called Control, and it has to do with a controlling nature which by its aggressiveness demands that other people comply. It looks and is meant to look like a mouth with teeth, and there is a Latin term called vagina dentata, and it basically has to do with a using of gender or sexuality to manipulate and control either spouses or children or general people that we are associated with. It's a very frightening one this one, but it has to be dealt with. Now this is again part of the Salome series, and it's called Descent. It was the last painting before this retrospective, last painting I did, and it speaks of having to descend into the darkness to find the light, depression, basically unable to rise out of, if you like, the depths of despair and so forth. But if one can forbear and understand the insights that you've been given during the descent, and there are many myths that talk about this, finding oneself through travelling and descending into the darkness, and in the darkness, somehow or another, you find the light. This one is fear. Fear holds so many people back. Just not being able to let go, to be a free spirit, to allow oneself to be as one really should be. And a lot of my thoughts as a teacher are about students who I know have ability but can't actually address that ability, because not only are they afraid of failing, but they are also actually afraid of succeeding, and that is a great tragedy. Softly Comes the Light. This is a different series of works on paper and paintings that I've been doing more recently, and it has to do more with trying to state things more simply. All artists are interested in light, and light that comes from the sun and affects whatever they're painting, but also light as a symbolic idea, the light of the inner being, the light that comes with happiness, and the light that comes through meditation, the light that has the mystery contained in it and finds its way through the dark to inform us about what we need to do, once again, to live wholly and healthily and authentically. The Stations of the Cross, I came to it through a time when I was struggling a little bit, and I thought of the iconology of the Stations of the Cross, which is by and large Catholic, but it has to do with the falls and how one continually makes the same mistakes. And in order to find one's way through the difficulties, you have to be able to recognise that you're making the failings again and again, and also that you must forgive yourself and get up, pick up your burden, which in the Stations of the Cross is the cross itself. And when I began the series, I started with the 3 falls, but as I progressed, I realised that each picture in the Stations of the Cross carried an archetypal idea, and Pontius Pilate at the beginning is a politician. He is washing his hands of Christ and the difficulty of making the decision about crucifying him. So we all know about politicians who suffer from the dilemma of political expediency. The second image shows Christ accepting his burden. The cross symbolises all our burdens that we have to carry through life, many and varied, but we all have to carry them. Christ meets his mother, and it so often happens in the parental role. Our children are caught in terrible situations, and the pain is not only carried by the child, but is also carried by the parent, especially when they know that their child carries the truth. This one speaks of altruism. Simon of Cyrene, who helped Christ after his second fall, helps him to take the burden on again, and we are all in need of our own altruistic supports along the way. These are the women of Jerusalem who came to look at Christ on this road to Calvary because they'd heard that he said many wise things, and they wanted to see him for themselves and assess whether or not they should follow his teachings. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus, and this is an image of compassion. Christ is becoming very weak, and Veronica is there to give him strength through her love and kindness. This is the third and last fall of Christ. He is beaten. He needs now to meet his fate, and he will be lifted up by a soldier who then strips him of his clothing. Now, being stripped naked before one meets one's death is quite symbolic. There is no pretense anymore, there is no battle anymore. You have accepted your fate, and doing so gives some peace in the final moments. The centurion is looking at Christ with some sort of lack of understanding. Who is this man who has such equanimity at time of such cruelty? Here Christ is being nailed to the cross, and we're all nailed to our cross to some extent. If we can't understand or cope with our burden, then we are unable to free ourselves from the burden, and it's a cause of great agony. Here is Christ dead on the cross, and at this point of time, the women from Jerusalem are examining his wound made by a spear of a soldier, and there is no blood flowing, which means he is truly dead. It needs to be said that the cross is actually a symbol of what Carl Jung would call the duality of existence, the horizontal and the vertical, and it's our task, according to Jung, to overcome this duality, to accept that life has good and evil, dark and light, sadness and joy. We must accept this duality in order to be able to truly live a full life. And also the other aspect, the other symbolism here is that one must die to a current life in order to be resurrected into a new life. This is the Pieta. Christ has come down from the cross, been taken down, and he's held by his grieving mother. And it is probably the greatest sadness, I imagine, that any mother could experience, holding her dead child in her arms. Christ is in the tomb. I always felt myself that the resurrection should have been part of the series. This is a watercolour painting done whilst listening to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. I love this music. I find it very tribal, very exciting, very, very dramatic, and full of movement, and loud and soft, and every nuance that you can think of is in the 13 movements that he wrote, talking about the Rite of Spring. It did come from a tribal myth and reflects it very much in terms of the music that it presents. It was done for a ballet, and Nijinsky was the main dancer. It caused a riot when it was first played in Paris, 1913, but it has become one of the most popular of the contemporary classical musical pieces. Watercolour I hadn't had much to do with until I painted this series, but I found it was a wonderful medium. It required me doing something like six or seven layers of watercolour on each sheet, and I painted 9 of the 13 movements, which was about 50 watercolours. This is just one of them. Now, this painting is called Tilting at Windmills, and you would know that that talks about Don Quixote and his mad romantic casting of himself towards these mythical giants you saw in the distance, which were really windmills turning their great propellers around, but which he couldn't see properly, and so he had to rush in and fight these mighty beasts. And it epitomises Spain for me, because Spain is an incredibly romantic country, full of passion, full of foolhardiness, and quite often full of great sadness with the bullfights, darkness with the Inquisition, probably the extremes of human emotions and endeavours. So this is my tilting at windmills. This figure leaping forward on the left there in the white oil colour is obviously Don Quixote. This is a stylised tree. It's called Tree Spirit, and it's a totem. I was asked to put my ear to a tree one time by a friend, and when I did that, I heard a rushing right inside the middle of the tree, and I was told it was the sap running in the tree. I couldn't believe that I was actually hearing the life of the tree, but I was. And so from then on, I look at trees with a different eye. I know that just like we've got blood running through our veins, they have sap rushing through their core. And so this is a very graphic gestural approach to painting this symbol of life. And this is Trist. Trist means melancholy if you spell it with an I rather than a Y. And at the time, there was a great sadness in my life. We were losing a very deeply loved person, and the melancholy overwhelmed us all. And one of the things I know can be done is that if you visualise that and then make it concrete, that it can ease the pain. This is a large painting, and I had to do it using both hands to lift the paint up and to drag it up from the floor to the top of the canvas. And the depth of the black probably reflects the deepness of the pain, but the white coming in from the left and the right speaks of the hope, because every death brings hope, some new life, some new understanding, and that's what happened in this particular instance. This painting is called Dialectic, and the subheading is The Woman and the Cockatoo, or The Woman and the Cocky. And it came after many, many drawings of the woman and the bird, not always the cockatoo, but it finished. This is the last painting of the whole series that went on for a couple of years, where the cockatoo has reigned supreme, because it lives in my neighbourhood in the bush. It's very loud, very aggressive, very assertive, and I took it to be the symbol of nature, trying to reassert itself against the invasion of humankind represented by the woman. She is also attempting to engage with the cockatoo, and that's what the word dialectic means. It means that we must engage with the environment, we must engage with nature if we are to survive as a species. If we don't engage, if we don't relate, and if we don't understand the depth that our cohabitation requires, there will be no survival. And this picture talks about the dance that the bird and the female engage in after many, many other drawings where the cockatoo was screeching as loudly as he could, saying, for goodness sake, wake up.